Well, how about that, folks? Is Max Verstappen back in the title hunt? Oh, and what's that I hear in the background? Oh, it's the sound of a revenge arc getting its revenge! Carlos said it best. This podium mattered. As much as he claimed as his first ever with McLaren, and honestly, I can see the similarities in terms of emotion and significance. For me, this was a podium which looked very, very, very unlikely in being taken away from him, say from a colossal error in the pits or some kind of mechanical failure. And as Carlos has said time and time again this season, what could possibly go wrong with him probably ends up happening. Well, this time around, it didn't. Granted, for up until the second half of the race, he was destined in being second place, not pulling far too behind from Max Verstappen, but in the end, through some overcut wizardry from George Russell and Mercedes, he was taken from second and then put down into third. But considering that George Russell was on a tear and that hard-tyre strategy was looking absolutely dynamite, quite frankly, I think Carlos Sainz will be happy with third place. It's probably best just to conserve your energy and make sure you can keep Kimi Antonelli behind you. Does Williams even care right now? No. They probably don't. They qualified second place without any rain, and they stayed within the top three. This is the first time since, funnily enough, Baku 2017, their first podium of any kind in 4 years. Which is why it was quite nice to see Russell actually congratulate Williams and Carlos for their achievement. Alex has had his fair share of positions between 4th and 7th, but 3rd place, that podium, eluded him. Whereas now, it's the Spaniard who did it, who has had to deal with a lot of trials and tribulations and having far less points than the Thai driver this year, and it was Carlos who brought Williams over the 100-point barrier for the first time since 2016. It was him that did it, and I'm pretty sure that's what many people will be talking about. In terms of points, Albon still has more than double what Carlos has, but this was a huge step in the right direction for the Spaniard because everything went completely to task. Everything went as it should. Operationally speaking, it was a triumph for Williams. And also, speaking of Alex, it was really good to see him cheering along with the crew, that there was no bitterness or resentment. It reminded me of what happened at Melbourne when Carlos crashed out on the formation lap. He stuck around to help in terms of strategy. There was camaraderie there. And on balance, this was probably one of Carlos's most economical drives, and it was something that a team that is in a rebuilding phase really, really needed to see their driver on song and being able to prove what they can do. They just needed everything to actually go their way for once, and in that sense, it did. And I really hope that I don't see more of those comments where, yay, Williams gets a podium, but oh no, it's the wrong driver. You're in this together, you're in a rebuilding phase. Speaking as a McLaren fan who's been through the rebuilding phase, you need to be on song together. That way, you thrive. And then you've got to talk about Max Verstappen. He gambled on the hard tyre for the launch, and from there, he just got on with it. Another Grand Slam for the record books. It meant that there was no real competition in terms of cars similar in pace to Red Bull, but I don't think Max Verstappen really cares at the moment. He qualified on pole, the others didn't. There you go. He managed to make the most of the very murky, slippery conditions because there was a little bit of rain, there was a little bit of debris, and it was another morale-boosting effort for he and the team. It's really showing that what Red Bull's doing in the background behind the scenes is really paying dividends. And no, it's not quite enough for me to say Red Bull is back, biddy, but it's certainly a step in that same right direction. Just wait until Singapore, my friends. If they can turn out to be good there, oh, we're going to be on for a banger of a conclusion to this season, where we all thought it was done and dusted. Oscar Piastri is still a nice gap away from Max Verstappen in the championship, but Lando Norris and Max Verstappen, there's only 44 points between them. That could be spicy. And I'm seeing this online. People are starting to believe in Max, thinking, no way, could he actually get a 5th title? It's still a very tall order, but I'm happy to see this actually being contested, and I'm a McLaren fan. Bring it on, Max. I want to see this. I want to see both Oscar and Lando actually fight for this. And McLaren, you stay out of it. Leave it between those 3 drivers, okay? But yes, on a technical level, the car looked really, really good. It managed to make the hard tyre strategy work. In clear air, it looked absolutely peachy, including with Yuki Tsunoda. And it was just simply another simple day in the office. It's really showing that Law and Mekis has been a breath of fresh air for this team, and Max Verstappen is incredibly fired up at the moment. It was an incredible weekend for him, even though there was no fireworks to be had, but quite frankly, it was incredible because there were no fireworks to be had. And when you make Baku look really simple, considering that it is somewhere where you can be punished for a mistake, you're onto something special here. And again, 69 points between he and Oscar. It's a similar gap to what Lando and Max had last year, and everyone said that Lando had a chance of winning the title, so why couldn't Max be afforded the same speculation? And yeah, Mercedes, the winners. Toto, about them contracts, is this doing it for you? Seriously? Russell and Antonelli, that was a really good weekend for them. They split start tyres, then let the race come to them. And Antonelli was pressing Lawson throughout, which meant he was always looking spicy, but the more successful move was honestly Russell's long first run that set up an overcut, which got him past 3 cars, despite him feeling incredibly rough throughout the entire weekend. You know the whole thing, him feeling sick, he missed out on media days, he barely did anything except for driving the car, and then afterwards he was just off to rest. Well, considering all of that, he still wasn't 100% on race day, and he still was able to nail that tyre strategy going from 5th to 2nd. That is incredible. One of his most solid drives of the year, right up there with Bahrain in my opinion, and he's still technically a free agent next year. What the hell? And then there's Antonelli to be had here. What a way to really get yourself back on song. He had a faultless weekend, and he got past Lawson, as was pressuring Carlos a little bit. Not quite enough to pass him for 3rd, but honestly, that wasn't bad at all. And, oh yeah, this also, these 30 points, moved Mercedes back up to 2nd in the team titles. The Red Bull are getting closer to them though by about 3 points or so. The car's balance also on both compounds was solid without being knife edge, which really suited them well. They really produced themselves, Mercedes, a very solid platform and looked especially solid, really with Ferrari and McLaren looking incredibly weak, really anemic. And as for a team day, this was brilliant. Both of them were really good, and I loved that moment when Kimi actually slammed the door on George for a moment, and Russell was spitting feathers to no end. He was not expecting the Italian to be that feisty. I'm also pretty sure that Max Verstappen probably complimented him for that behind the scenes, saying, well done for that, that was really spicy. I gotta admit, I'm really happy for Antonelli for having enough balls to do that. He felt that confident to just go... And then George was like, blimey, and oh yeah, Kimi got back ahead of Albon in the championship. Nice. And equally nice was what Yuki Tsunoda was able to do. What he did around Baku was really, really, really important. And I barely hear anybody recognizing that. Still people saying that, oh, Max Verstappen is doing all of this single-handedly. Excuse me here. Just look at what Yuki did for him. He kept Lando, who's ahead of him in the championship, behind him. Convincingly so. So if we can get more of this from Tsunoda, grabbing some more constructors' points, being able to hold a McLaren behind for Max to get this closer in the championship, that's what Red Bull wants. Yeah, 6th place wasn't loud, but it was an error-free weekend, and he was giving Lando a headache, and that's exactly what Red Bull want to do after getting months of Zach Brown in their ear. He started well, and only ceded track position when Russell's hard-tyre offset came good. Then spent most of his Sunday holding off 2 Ferraris and a Norris. Seriously, this is really, really impressive stuff from Yuki, actually being able to do this kind of stuff in the RB21, which has really been plaguing him throughout the entire season thus far, that he had enough confidence to be hold back Lando on some really impressively fresh tyres toward the end of the race. He couldn't force a pass on Lawson though, but it was very, very close. And honestly, I felt like that was probably for the best considering what happened around the Italian Grand Prix between Yuki and Liam. They were keeping it cool. They weren't doing anything stupid. Yuki, he said that he was thinking about being the hero, but this time he chose not to. And that has been something he has been guilty of, especially at the early part of the season where he wanted to play the hero and it got him in trouble. And even though he and Liam are fighting supposedly for the last seat within the Red Bull group, both of them, especially Yuki, are doing a very good job in convincing the wider management, including Dr. Marco, and maybe keeping them both for next year. Because this is exactly what Red Bull and Racing Bulls wanted. But we're sticking to Yuki at the moment. This has been wonderful for him. His best ever result for that team. And also, he played his part in Red Bull, gathering the most amount of points they've had in a weekend in a very long time. 33 of them. 3 more than Mercedes, a buttload more than Ferrari, and now they are within 18 points of 2nd place in the Constructors. If Yuki can help Red Bull get up to 2nd, that would be a huge achievement and a very big shot in the arm in the Japanese driver remaining with the team, even though Honda said bye-bye to them. And we are starting to see Helmut Marko realizing that yes, Yuki's had a lot of resistance in the 2nd car. He's finally getting it. It's starting to dawn on the Austrian doctor that maybe that 2nd car needed some TLC, and now it's getting that TLC. That technical love and care. And if he can really do the business in qualifying and have this amount of race control, I can really see Yuki having a really strong end to the season and maybe have a chance of getting into the top 10 in the Drivers' Championship. That's what he needs to do. At least he's not last anymore. Well, I mean, in terms of last in the points-scoring drivers. And in the midst of all of this, Lawson's 5th place was all about composure under pressure, and to make the decision regarding his future just as complex. He spent the first stint defending from faster cars without wearing the rears. That was pretty solid. And from there, after Kimi ultimately dispatched him, Lawson's task was just to keep it tidy and remain in the top 5. Because let's not forget, Tsunoda and Norris were not that far behind him, and he had a job to keep them behind him. And as I said with Tsunoda, those two had awkward troublings in the previous race, and they managed to keep it clean and tidy. That'll be impressing anyone within the Red Bull fold, and this is Lawson's best ever result, and he was leagues ahead of Isaac Hadjar, who was very much having a bit of a, not so great weekend. And it was his clutch of 10 points primarily that got Racing Bulls ahead of Aston Martin in 6th place in the Constructors. And even though it's looking a little bit unlikely they could get the dream result of 5th place, 6th place for them is not too shabby at all, and it's the New Zealander who is starting to come online and able to doing that. Sure, you might be saying, oh, well, you didn't do that great, you couldn't keep 3rd. Well, come on, 2 Mercedes overtook him. Mercedes. Fair dinkum. And weekends like this will definitely cement the New Zealander in Formula 1 for a little bit longer, and we're heading to Singapore. That is the race that he really made his mark in out-qualifying Verstappen in the RB19. Yeah, this is going to be interesting what we can see from Liam going forward at tracks he's already raced at. And it's doing really well in how he's conducting himself and making people think he's changed his ways. He's not nearly as combative. And then we get to the meh with Isaac Hadjar. His P10 does read modest, the driver underneath though was a little bit mixed. He started 8th, which was good, and he started in clean air. But then an early error through the final corner down the long straight, it cost him momentum and places. Some speculated that it might have been that supposed hydraulic issue before they got to the grid that might have come back to haunt him, but no. Isaac then said that it was simply down to something that he did, it was a mistake which cost him 2 places, and therefore it really took the wind out of his sails, which is funnily enough because wind was a very major factor around Baku. And that left him in the wake of some slightly faster cars, and it meant that, put simply, on the medium tyres he just had to grin and bear it. The hards were better for him, but he never looked really electric or punchy. It was a case of just surviving for the rest of the race, and him being able to score that final point was still a little bit of a miniature achievement. Isaac was able to play his part in Racing Bulls just going, hey, another double points weekend, which is perfectly valid. But just in comparison to what Liam was able to do, that 3rd place, still remaining in the top 5 by the end of it all, having no issues whatsoever and keeping it clean, he scored a point which keeps him from the loser's cycle, but he was still the lowest placed Red Bull driver. And hey, ultimately it's all good experience, and it's all going into Singapore, which is going to be the first time he's going around that track ever, so it'll be a very tall order for him to be able to cope with all of the humidity and heat there. So it'll be a case of just attrition and survival there, but if he can score a point there, that'll still be very major kudos headed the Frenchman's way. So quite frankly, game on between he and Liam. And then we've got Bortoletto. It was a bit of a quiet weekend for him, but he left it with 11th, and the quiet satisfaction of him having a clean weekend and had doing everything that he could do. The long first stint that he did, it did put him in clean air, and it meant that he could actually make some progress. He went from 13th to 11th, although technically he only made up 1 place since Oscar Piastri had his retirement. We'll get to that in a bit. But then he had his pit stop, he fell back, he managed to pick off a couple of struggling cars, I'm looking at US Esteban Ocon, but after that, it was just simply a case of just waiting out the clock, really. Points were not looking really likely at all, since he was 30 seconds behind Isaac Hadjar, who finished 10th, but it was still him being the best of the non-points finishers. That is something that he can be proud of, that the Sauber can do something in low downforce configurations. It was just not quite enough in being able to him to get yet more points after what he's able to do in Monza. It was nothing remarkable, but Bortoletto was at least able to keep Oliver Behrman behind him toward the end part of the race within like a half a second or so. And speaking of Oliver Behrman, I would describe him as being the other meh driver. His 12th was a study in patience. Starting in the pack with little strategic options, he lost ground in the safety car restart and then had to get comfy within traffic, as we know. The Haas had okay pace, and he felt that second stint had a better feel to at least try and go for 10th, albeit a very slim chance. And the problem that he had is what pretty much the majority of the drivers had, in that he just simply did not have enough confidence or tyre advantage to be able to send it into turn 1 and then hope for the best. And like Bortoletto, he was 30 seconds ultimately behind 10th place, which meant that really, points were not an option. P11th was the best that he could possibly hope for. And after a really bruising Saturday in which Ocon got disqualified for a technical infringement, this was a fairly solid pace in recognising that, hey, the Haas car isn't terrible, it's just not quite there to be able to try and go for points. There are other teams that are ahead of them, which is really relegating Haas down to 9th place, and the best they can probably hope for is maybe a cheeky go at maybe 7th place, although 8th place seems to be the most likely outcome. So I think it's fair to say that Behrman's weekend, it was decent, it was reasonable, it was fair, just not spectacular really. He did the best he could. The team will appreciate that, even if the fans don't. Now we get to the losers, and we start off with, of course, McLaren. Now, I feel really confused here. Why do I feel oddly nostalgic? Oh, that's right. I've been a long-term McLaren fan. I remember the days when McLaren could barely score, and they couldn't figure anywhere near the top points-paying positions. Memories. But yeah, Baku really hit hard, didn't it? McLaren, throughout the entire weekend, just looked completely nowhere. They were really struggling, and it was simply down to the fact that that car is simply too draggy. It didn't have the top speed, and they didn't have mini DRS to fall back on since it's been banned since their time round last year. And it meant that there was no constructor glory here today. It is going to happen around Singapore. The gap between themselves and Mercedes now is simply far too vast to be able to overcome by the end of Abu Dhabi. But it does make you wonder, if you just started tuning in and this was your first race, you'd think McLaren were a midfield team, how bad or just mediocre they were. Now, I may be an Oscar stan, but I've got to admit, my boy was horrible this weekend. Nothing like last year at all, and even he knew it. Not only did he crash in qualifying, having a sympathy one after Leclerc had done so before him, Piastri then jumped the lights after a supposed clutch glitch triggered the anti-stall, dropped to last, then hit the wall. And yeah, that 5-second time penalty, yeah, that was a slam dunk, as Martin Brundle would say. But he is not going to have to serve around Singapore since technically, well, he got that time penalty served to him, and then he retired. And anyone who's a Lando fan who might be thinking that that's not fair, well, Lando got a 5-second time penalty, which he did serve, and he retired, and that didn't get carried forward to the next race. So, yeah, the FIA is thinking regarding papaya rules. You know, it's got to be fair. So anyway, with one car out of its own volition, really recognising the dirty track off the line, it was all down to Lando to try and salvage something, and arguably, he just couldn't get anywhere close in getting forward. He started 7th, he finished 7th, and at one point, it looked like he was going to fall back 2 positions. And we were reminded that this track is not one of Lando's favourites. Arguably, it's one of his worst. He's only been in the top 5 once in his career, and that was mainly gifted by Sainz and Perez being taken out of the equation. He ran long on the opening stint, and in theory, that might have gotten him past Tsunoda and Lawson and maybe challenging for 5th, so 10 points against Piastri, not too shabby. But then he had a slow stop, that added 2 seconds, and he ended up behind Tsunoda and Lawson, having to battle with Leclerc. And yeah, it meant that he could only grab 6 points, which means Piastri is still 25 points ahead of him, and Max Verstappen, right behind him in the championship, has managed to gain 19 on him. So I'm thinking Norris is going to be getting some flashbacks from last year, except the shoe is on the other foot. It's Max chasing him. The car had decent race pace in clear air, just not enough in the toe to force pass after pass, just not enough speed behind Tsunoda's really undraggy car. Neither he or Oscar looked great this weekend, and Norris very much laid his heart on his sleeve about it, whilst Oscar just, well, emulated Fernando and kicked back to watch the race from the barriers. And speaking of Ferrari, knocked in the mix of them, Mr. Baku, he did not turn up this weekend. Ferrari left with 8th and 9th, and they've lost 2nd in the Constructors. And they started off the weekend really strong. I thought they were going to be in with a shout of maybe being within the top 5, or maybe having a little cheeky punt in getting Leclerc his first win around Baku. They split tyres, as you do, just to try and get some difference in strategy, one going long, one going shorter. They swapped positions in the middle to try and give one a bit of a fair fight, and then their intention was to swap it back again if it didn't work. But then he got that instruction a little bit too late, which meant that the pass back ultimately failed by about 4/10 or so. And that was mainly down to the race engineer just being too late, and then Lewis realising that it got completely mucked up. And this was another case of miscommunication, undoing a plan, albeit for just 8th and 9th place. So no, this was not the case of Lewis being selfish or being grumpy and not giving Leclerc the place back. It was down to his race engineer, again. Yet the bigger story probably was about pace. There wasn't any. Both drivers sat in DRS for long stretches and they couldn't do much about it. And then Charles supposedly reported engine gremlin, so that's great. And hopefully Singapore will suit the Ferrari car better, so I think they might look to that weekend instead. But yeah, this was a sloppy weekend for Ferrari, as it was for McLaren. You've got to remember, these were two of the big teams before Mercedes managed to get their huge clutch of points. You wouldn't think that based on this race in isolation. And then we've got Alex Albon as another big loser. In the midst of Carlos getting a podium before he could for Williams, Albon's afternoon never really recovered after he started near the back. And then, of course, he had his mid-race tangle with Franco Colapinto, which, I'm sorry, that was a really silly move, and it just completely ruined Franco's weekend, which looked really quite solid considering it's an Alpine around a power circuit, and deservedly so, Albon got a time penalty. And if you're thinking I'm being harsh regarding Albon, even Tomo agrees with the wider world and says, yeah, that was a slam dunk penalty, mate. That was an absolute clanger, mate. Even Tomo couldn't defend his boy. And it's a real shame, honestly, because as Sainz was able to prove in clear air, that Williams car had potential. There might have been an opportunity for Albon to maybe get back into the points, but because of that 10-second penalty, what should have been P11 by quite a few seconds over Bortoleto and Behrman was 13th on the road. But yeah, I think the team then remembered the rules of what it's like to be in DRS trains, stuck in traffic and what have you, not really being able to do much, and then the incident with Franco meant that Albon forgot said rules. He just had to wait and pick his moment down the straight, instead of going into a left-hand 90-degree corner. So yeah, fate decided to look on Alex's shoulder instead of Carlos, but I'm still happy that Albon looked past all of that and was really happy for Carlos, his teammate, and the achievement that the team was able to do. Because let's not forget, as I said in Carlos's segment, Albon has been the one to bring the majority of the points. He's done a lot for this team. Now it's Carlos's time to shine, and maybe this might motivate Albon to be even better, which is going to benefit both of them, especially going into next year. He's had a great season, but this weekend was a bad one. And again, Tomo agrees with the wider world. Then we have Ocon. This was going to be a long day for him because, for starters, he was disqualified from qualifying after a rear wing infringement dropped him to the back. One that has concluded was down to a design flaw rather than them being accused of cheating. So after that, just go long and see what happens. And there was a safety car. They did make the most of it. They swapped the tyres. That means they wouldn't have to come in again. So it just resulted in him just staying out there and then hoping for the best that maybe a point might be afforded him. It was simply not enough to get any higher than 14th. That's still a really decent effort considering where they started in 20th, but it was simply not enough to be able to be the one ahead of Behrman or being really troubling the points. There were passes to be had, but traffic limited said passes, and again, when everyone else put fresher boots on, they were able to suddenly get past the Frenchman. It was a very spirited effort. I do credit Haas for the execution in being able to pull it off, but it was simply one step too far. It was fair enough for Haas to try. At least they tried. The same thing could be said for Aston Martin. They gave it a try, but this was a really blunt weekend for them, and after a really couple solid weekends where they really exceeded expectations, they came back down to earth with a bump. And a jump start thanks to Fernando Alonso, who did hold his hand up and say, yeah, that is on me. I reacted to Piastri, which is perfectly reasonable, because, well, hey, you got to try and make the most of it. You're looking at the car right ahead of you. He still finished ahead of Stroll, though, but neither car looked likely of scoring points anyway, even with Fernando starting 11th. All of this limited options and the pair fell down the field, and yeah, nothing else really to say, honestly. Except for the larger picture, this puts them behind Racing Bulls and the Constructors in P7. Now, I don't think really Aston Martin are going to be that upset. They're really looking to next year, and if this does give them the extra wind tunnel time, then fair enough. They can just stomach this. They have plenty of investment. They have a spirited driver. They've got Enrico Cardile coming online. Adrian Newey's happy with the car that he's designing so far. It's all looking okay for next year. So this year, hey, okay. They're not going to be last, that's for darn sure. They've certainly got enough left in the tank to not be 9th. So 7th place, whatever, fine. But it was still a very sobering weekend after the couple of surprises that we've had, especially the likes of Monza. And as for Nico Hülkenberg, yeah, this wasn't a good day for him. He's had a fair few of those recently, actually. And once the early phases settled, he found himself, again, in traffic near the back, after having bumped Ocon. No real chances to move up the field after that for the German. And he really was very much behind Bortoleto. This was another weekend where the Brazilian rookie was able to run rings around the German. And in terms of the plan, Sauber looked like a team that they were able to do it as they were hoping to do. It's just they simply lacked that little bit extra, which is something you can easily say for some of the other teams. There was just that little extra couple of tenths or something on the tyres to be able to make the most of a DRS pull down the straight and then do a handy and tidy go into turn 1. So yeah, it was a very anonymous weekend for the German. The Sauber didn't look terrible. At least they finished on the same lap as the leaders, which is not something that could be said for the Alpine drivers, them finishing a lap down. Having said that though, I sensed it was going to be a bad day since this is a very major power circuit. Thusly, they split tyres to manufacture opportunities like all the other teams. They met each other constantly but kept it clean, which was good. But unfortunately, all of that good work for Franco especially, who was able to get up to the dizzying heights of P13, not bad for an Alpine around, again, a power circuit, it was all undone, and the Argentinian ultimately finished 19th because of it. All of that hard work completely wasted, the Thai driver getting a 10-second penalty, deservedly so. And as for Gasly, he was perpetually tagged to the back. He qualified down there, he stayed down there. He didn't really make any headway despite being on the harder tyre. And at this rate, there's really no need to finger point at this team. They're just trying to survive the remaining few races with the limited options that they have with the Renault engine. It's not going to get any better. They're changing their ways. Next year, it's all about that. Like with Aston Martin, they're just grinning and bearing it at this point. They are far behind Haas. They're last in the constructors. Just try and make the most of it with the extra wind tunnel and ATR time, yeah. But one thing I really want to make clear here is that this was a weekend where Franco, again, looked the better driver. He outqualified Pierre again, and he might have finished ahead of Pierre again had it not been that altercation with Alex. This was a really reasonable weekend for Franco, especially now we've realised from Briatore it's between him and Paul Aron for the seat next year. There is no one else being considered. There's no Yuki Tsunoda in the equation here to go back with his bestie Pierre. No. Given what that car can do or what it cannot do, this was a very reasonable weekend for Franco, which was completely taken out of his own hands. And a sensible decision from you would maybe to consider this video, which I think you'll really, really like. I'll see you over there. I'm just going to go and change my top. I'll be right with you.